We're having a conversation with Rick Foster, who is really one of the more unique and special people that's working in corporations today, and also an extraordinary speaker on subjects of leadership, organizational change, and basically well-being, as well as a lot of related subjects. I've known Rick for a while through the Transformational Leadership Council, and his work is truly inspiring, and it's grounded both in science as well as years and years of practice and experience working with lots of very special people. Rick, I'm so glad we're here to have this conversation, and one of the things that I was interested in, really, we were talking earlier about sort of how do you, with all your travels and all the different groups you work with, sort of see what's going on in the world, everything from climate change to Donald Trump. What's going on?
What's going on? I actually will tell you, I don't know if you know this, I've actually worked now on all 7 continents. The Antarctic was quite a trip. I do get a survey. I mean, that's part of what makes my life delicious. I mean, I'm all over the place. What I see is complexity. What I see is incredible beauty, incredible productivity, incredible relationships, and I see greed running the show for some people and some places.
Do you think this is universal, or is it primarily a U.S. Conversation?
I see it happening all over the world. All over the world. You know, the economic world is homogeneous now to the extent that I think corporate culture is running the show in a lot of places. Mm-hmm. So it's, it might be an American export, but the corporate world is pretty homogeneous worldwide. But then, of course, we have wonderful cultural stuff happening that varies from place to place.
Well, I share that sort of sense of wonder that is also going on, because it's not all about in fact, one of the things I've sort of gotten into is that we really cannot predict what's going to happen. Long range is maybe a few months or maybe a year in some industries. But really to be able to predict is sort of folly at this point. On the other hand, I think about it, almost all of our systems are built on prediction. Budgeting, finance, many of our industries are built on it. Certainly most people organize their lives based upon prediction, whether it's what's going to happen at Christmas or what am I going to do with my career if you're younger. And so I'm wondering if on one hand life is becoming increasingly unpredictable, and yet on the other hand our life is organized around predictability. How do we reconcile or begin to engage or get into that paradox?
Well, I see a lot of this issue. I think that what I would say is living a life based on a prediction is big trouble. It's big trouble whether you're a large corporation or an individual. The world is changing so fast that whatever we predict, really we have to assume it's not going to be the case, and it's going to change. But the act of predicting, the act of analyzing, the act of looking at where we're going is critically important. It's creative, it's wonderful, it helps to shape the future. But certainly my corporate clients, my God, a decade ago they were doing 5-year and 10-year strategic plans. Now they're lucky if they do a 12-month plan.
Well, that's my experience as well. And I have this notion of life or reality as sort of an emerging phenomenon. It's like appearing, and in fact, maybe it's always been that way, but it used to be 50 or 100 years between one reality emerging and another reality disappearing.
The realities are changing very, very quickly. Part of it, of course, is the technological world that we live in, and the world has truly shrunk. But it's an extremely creative process when we try to predict, when we bring in all factors from this very complex world, and we end up energizing ourselves, I think, in the process of predicting. But again, if we think that we can rely on a prediction, and you know what, even more so, if we think that we can rely on the past to predict the future, we're in big trouble.
Yeah, maybe that's where we're going, because I've actually am much more rigorously suggesting that any prediction, or even broad prediction, is no longer a feasible strategy.
It's kind of a waste of time.
Well, but you just said it, because you said if you're using the past to ground your prediction, I use the word anticipate to try to make a distinction, because I think the word prediction sort of evokes the notion of trends and trying to somehow take the past and project it into the future, and then make whatever analysis you make. Anticipating is more like being awake, being open, being a trained observer of connections and things that are trying to occur. If you could have seen the connection between the iPhone, the taxi industry, the software for coordination,
Right.
You might have been able to anticipate an Uber-type disruptive event in the industry. But it's the ability to observe those connections, I think, that gives us the capacity to imagine a future that's got some grounding, or that you could perhaps make a bet on.
I think anticipating the future is actually using the best of our brains. It's our executive function. It's what the neuroscientists would call goal management. But what it really is we see things, we synthesize things, and it leads us to take action. On the other hand, having a stable, sure prediction, I think personally, paralyzes us.
Why, yes, absolutely.
Because all we do is we shoot for the prediction, we don't make it
That's
to begin
right.
with.
We have a prediction, and then we organize our resources, our commitments, our plans, and all that around the prediction, and it ultimately becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Right. We're limiting.
Or we end up with a big explanation for what happened.
Right. But what I love is this notion of, let's look at what's happening right now. Let's try to anticipate what's happening. But most importantly, let's take action.
That's right.
Because action is the key to everything. Without action, we become passive observers. We become less accurate. We become less engaged. We become less the kind of people that we want to be, and certainly less the kind of professionals.
You're pointing at something, Rick, that's been sort of at the center of my work for a long time, which has to do with the nature of action, and really what is action. Now, I have this theory that you can't observe something, it's not actionable. So if you have a concept like trust, we could talk about trust as a good thing, and we could build models, and we could have all kinds of stuff, but if you can't articulate what you're observing when you're observing whatever you call trust, then you can't take an action to cause trust or produce trust. So like I say, leaders need to be able to make trust happen. Otherwise, it just becomes an excuse if it's missing. So one of the thoughts that I'm interested in, and see what you think of this, is in my work, the idea of action is very related, maybe synonymous with the word commitment. That since most of our work, if not all of it, takes place in conversations anyway, that it's really the capacity to make a commitment that opens up a different path, a different reality, and makes something else happen. So I would offer that one of the difficulties we have in corporations is people are so fixated on their reasons for committing that they often lose touch with the act of committing, and that the act of committing itself is what really is how we create the future.
Plus, I think people are very much fear-driven, so they're afraid of committing.
Well, and Foucault said that everybody's been manipulated by commitment when they were kids. I mean, one of my favorite themes that I love to share with people is the idea of we have to separate the moral issues from the phenomenon of commitment. Because if you bury commitment as a good, bad thing, or you raise your children to believe that it's good to keep commitments and bad not to keep commitments, then you're basically building in a risk avoidance pattern in which people only commit to what's safe, reasonable, and understandable. And in that way, we need to really open it up to show people that there are consequences if you don't keep your commitments, but they're not moral consequences. And in the world today, we need people that can take bold commitments and commit to things that are outside their normal comfort zones in order to be able to deal with the rate of change and the complexity that you were talking about.
I totally agree with you. I mean, I would go out on a limb, and I'm not even sure I believe this, but just apropos this discussion, I would say all commitment is good. All commitment is good because it leads us to action. We can at least test what we're doing and course correct. If we're not committed, if we're not taking action, we're falling apart.
Well, I mean, I'll go out on a limb with you and say that I think that commitment is basically all there is, and that even if people say they're not committed, then at some point they're committed to not being committed. You know, but you know,
Love it.
if you're on the fence long enough, you decide pretty soon you must be committed to being on the fence. But the really interesting thing here is we talk about this new world that whatever is emerging, is I have this idea that only the individual can make a commitment, that the concept we commit is a false concept. You can commit and I can commit and we can coordinate and align our commitments.
Mm-hmm.
But we cannot commit. Only you can commit and only I can commit. However, neither one of us can fulfill our commitments without other people. So it's a big paradox.
The essence of a healthy team
Exactly.
is actually what you're talking about.
Really?
Well, listen, you brought up a really interesting topic, if you don't mind.
No.
How do you factor trust into this discussion? Because you brought up the topic of trust.
Well, first of all, I mean, I think at one level you could say it's a mood.
It's certainly a sensation.
It's a
We
sensation.
can feel it.
And people, I think, have become sort of inoculated to being very rigorous about it. So we do two things wrong with the word trust.
Mm-hmm.
One is we generalize.
Mm-hmm.
So we say, I don't trust you, rather than I don't trust you to be on time, or I don't trust you to write well,
Mm-hmm.
or I don't trust you to not speak behind my back. So at one level, I think of trust as just an assessment. It's just a judgment.
Mm-hmm.
It's a judgment that you're not going to keep your commitments, or it's a judgment that I can't count on you in one way or another. But I also think that trust is an act that we generate, and that is something that we give each other. It is not. I hate it when people talk about you have to earn commitment.
Ah,
There's a whole
me too.
there's a whole side conversation I have about we speak about trust as if it's a virtue, but we use it like a weapon.
Mm-hmm.
We basically say you behave the way I think you should behave and do what I want you to do, and I'll trust you. But if you don't do what I want, then you're not trustworthy.
But that reduces trust to the issue of reliability.
Exactly.
And listen, an axe murderer can be reliable.
Well, I mean,
Do we trust him? No.
well, the mafia keeps their commitments, and,
Right.
and lots of big leaders don't.
Let me throw something out to you about trust, because here's what I observe functionally as I go from executive team to executive team to executive team. If, in my experience, trust is a feeling, it's a sensation. We have it for someone or we don't have it for someone. This goes beyond reliability, because again, you have the axe murderer paradox. Axe murderer could be reliable. This is just a deep human sensation that we have relative to another person. And I know how to build that sensation and to create that sensation. If it's missing, you can have the brightest, the most committed individually people. You can have the best so-called strategy. You can have the best laid plans. If you don't have that feeling of trust, everything erodes.
I couldn't agree more. And
So it becomes an issue.
I don't know if you've read, I think it's Schwab's new book called The Fourth Industrial Revolution. But he's talking about the times we're in now could be made analogous to the First Industrial Revolution. And he then talks about several other ones. But the idea, though, is that this world that we're building is pluralistic, number one. We're all in the soup together.
Indeed.
Okay, we're all connected in profoundly intimate ways at the level of connection.
Yeah.
And that if we're going to evolve our institutions and our organizations and our practices to be able to create a world, everybody talks about the virtue of collaboration. And collaboration is not the absence of competition. But it's how do you be able to interact in a way, for example, that if I'm developing a new vaccine for Zika or something, that I can share my learning with you, and you can trust that. And he talks a lot about this issue of trust, that we really need to elevate trust to a level of competency analogous to reading. Okay, that trust becomes a kind of literacy
Yes.
of relating and relationship. And again, my view is at some point, if you're really responsible and don't make trust the other person's job, and if you realize that when you trust someone, it says more about you than it does them, then you begin to see that you can sometimes trust people to not do something. You can trust people to be screw-ups. But then what happens is you may have issues, but they're not trust issues.
Right.
And you stop using trust as a currency for relationship. You begin to create trust as a ground of being and a foundation for relationship.
That completely reflects my experience. If it's a foundation, And let's say you have a team, you've got 12 people who need to work together, whether it's a medical issue or a multi-billion-dollar decision, whatever it is. If trust is there, they then can function well. And what I'm seeing actually, I mean, I'm big on the brain science.
Mm-hmm.
If you have trust, you have a group of people who have cumulative high levels of executive function. They're in their cerebral cortex.
Mm-hmm.
They're innovative, they're creative, they're problem solving, they can work together.
And I would gather by extension, if something goes off the rails, they can put it back, they can deal with it and address it as an issue rather than...
They're resilient.
It doesn't become a story that now justifies isolation and separation and undermining.
Exactly it.
Yeah.
The contrary is people who are so stressed or indeed traumatized, or there's massive acute change going on, whatever traumas they're dealing with, or have they traumatized one another, they're not in their executive function. They're in their cerebral subcortex, the reptile brain. They're in fight, flight, freeze. If you're in fight, flight, freeze, you cannot innovate.
Right. Well, of course not.
So for me, positive action, creative action, comes from this cumulative executive function that we can create on teams. Trust is the first place, but if you have trust, then action, commitment, exactly your thematic, it's where the teams go, and they're really resilient.
Rick, a related theme to trust, I think, might be the work I understand you're doing on happiness. And what is happiness?
Happiness has been a fascinating thematic and an accidental thematic in my life and my partner's life. There's just the two of us. We have done executive and team training and organizational culture work for about 25 years. At some point, he wanted to write a book about leadership. I said, I don't want to write about leaders. Leaders can be just miserable, and I don't want to spend my weekends writing about miserable people. So Greg's a sharp guy, and he said, all right, well, let's write about happy people. It is a very long story, but we ended up traveling all over the country and ultimately all over the world, interviewing people who consider themselves to be extremely happy. It has been an amazingly illuminating and informative project, because what happened is we had two things going on: leadership training, the organizational culture work going on, and then this happiness project. At some point, we realized that the choices made by extremely happy people were the same choices being made by the best leaders we were working with. So we ended up with a model of behaviors that was both happiness and leadership.
Interesting.
The next step beyond that was that we presented to a whole bunch of medical leaders, mostly doctors and high-level nurses who were in leadership positions. All we were doing is talking about leadership, but they approached us immediately and said, this is fascinating. You have a bunch of people who are happy and make certain choices that make them happy. Are they, in fact, using their brains, their conscious brains, to regulate their own biochemistry? What's happiness, after all? Biochemistry. So here's an example. The happiest people tell the truth. Go to leadership. The best leaders tell the truth.
Oh, I see.
Right? It's a choice to tell the truth. When you choose to tell the truth, you are regulating your biochemistry upward. We know this because we've been able to measure this for years with a polygraph, for almost a century. So we go from happiness to leadership and then to health, because it turns out that all of these happiness choices that were fairly universal all over the world, appreciation, truth-telling, accountability, opening up options, flexible thinking, they're all associated with health outcomes. So we ended up with a happiness, leadership, health model, and then ultimately we couldn't figure out why it was working all over the world. And a medical anthropologist slapped me upside the head and said, you're missing a really important thing. Anything we are universally hardwired for, that is, the human species is universally hardwired for, is for the survival of the species. And what kind of species are we? We're a clan species. We don't have the sharpest claws, the sharpest teeth, we have no exoskeleton. What makes us survive? We're extraordinary as interrelated people, and we do very well as clans. So as clans, what had we been doing? Team training.
Yeah.
So the whole thing went full circle: happiness to leadership, to health, to clan success.
That's great. You know, I'm working on a book, or have been for some time. I'm very much into aging and looking at aging as a paradigm and as a conversation. Really, it's not just the biological change. And I've kind of distilled from my own experience 5 fundamental, essentially, points of living. 2 of which you've already named. One is health, happiness. I add creative self-expression. I also add love. And I add being valued. And I've never been able to find anything that didn't fit under one of those 5 intentions or 5 objectives. So whether it's money or power or celebrity or accomplishment, it all somehow organizes itself around love, health, happiness, creativity, and being valued. And the thing I found is that I agree with you also that those are choices. Now, most people don't live that those are choices. They live that those are caused by circumstance, or that they're caused by history, or caused by good fortune. And that when people are able to really own them as choices, then suddenly they are able to distinguish between the choice they have about how they interpret their situation. And I found in my own experience, for example, happiness, I hadn't thought about telling the truth, but I found is very much related to acceptance. And when I think about this rapidly changing world, it seems to me that things are moving so fast we don't have time to rely on the past to tell us what to do in the future. And we don't have time to protect ourselves against all the things we could imagine could go wrong. And so therefore a big part of being happy is being in the present and being in the moment and accepting life on its own terms.
That's absolutely the case.
Yeah, and then the only thing I'm adding to that, and I'd love your comment on this, is I have this notion that we don't have a lot of choice about what's going on because of the accelerating change, because of the complexity, perhaps because it's not predictable anymore, perhaps because we don't have control anymore, or if we ever did. But we always have a choice in how we relate to the world and how we relate to all of those things. And so therefore the muscle, which also connects back to choice and teamwork, is the muscle of choosing and designing and exercising the choices we have in how we relate to ourselves, other people, circumstances. I would throw in time and the future.
I couldn't agree more. And if you go all the way back to the Stoics, they wrote about the same thing. And if you fast forward to Viktor Frankl, he wrote about the same thing.
Exactly.
But what a whole bunch of extremely happy people told us who had not read the Stoics or Viktor Frankl, I promise you, average people who consider themselves to be extremely happy, it is exactly what you just said. They believe that they can choose their reactions.
And choose their reality.
And therefore they're choosing the reality, as opposed to a bunch of miserable people who we interviewed who basically told us that they're victims of circumstance.
Yeah. Rick, this has been phenomenal. I really appreciate your time.
Me too.
And I hope that we can do this again.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jim.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.